Welcome back to Impossible Shots. This time around in our eye effects series, we look at the more exotic warping effects, pupil dilation, and even otherworldly eye effects like the classic Catwoman look. On the way through, you'll learn your way around a spline-warper, as well as some of the gotchas to look out for. We'll even throw in a little bit of Nuke expression work. Well, with all that to cover, we'd best get to it. I'll be working exclusively in Nuke for this session because it has a great, well-behaving spline warper, and frankly, you really can't do this kind of work easily without one. You can download Nuke non-commercial for free, limited to 1920 by 1080 output, or subscribe to the affordable Nuke Indie, which offers full 4K output for commercial work. Now, in the previous video on changing eye color, I mentioned that tracking is often impossible when you're dealing with a lot of saccades, the sudden jerky eye movement of the typical eye. The good news is that most eye warping shots are filmed with the actor holding a fairly steady gaze, so they usually are trackable. And that's the case with our sample shot. And before you ask, no, that wasn't our green screen work, so there's nothing we can do about the hair composite. We'll start our effect at frame 40, where the eye opens after a blink. Okay, so let's start tracking. I'll go through the process with the screen left eye here because it's the trickiest, but you'll obviously want to rinse and repeat for the right eye. We'll start by tracking the pupil. Since the eyeball is a rigid body, we only need to track one point to get a lock for both the pupil and the iris, but the closer to the center, the better. In this case, I'll track backwards from frame 70. Once I get to the frames where the eyelid closes, I'll back up to the last good tracked frame, offset my target range. In Nuke, that's a control or command drag of the tracking region, and continue to track one frame at a time until we get to the point where the iris isn't visible anymore. Okay, with the tracking complete, let's work on the warp. The last frame of the sequence, frame 70, provides a nice clear frame of the eyes to work from. The spline warper in Nuke is actually a warp tool and a morph tool. A morph tool is simply two warps combined and cross-dissolved, with the first image warping into the shape of the second, and the second image starting out warped into the shape of the first, and then straightening itself back out over time. We then cross-dissolve between them. Since we only want to warp the image here rather than transform it into something else, we'll focus on the A-side shape. Nuke refers to the starting and ending images as the A-side shape and the B-side shape. Since we only want to warp the image here rather than transform it into something else, we'll focus on the A shape. I'll click and drag out a shape for the pupil, clicking back on the first point to close it out. I'll then tweak the Bezier handles to get a nice round shape. You can press Z or Shift Z in Nuke to loosen or tighten the smoothness of selected points. Alright, we'll repeat the process for the boundary of the iris. At this point, I don't care that I'm including part of the upper eyelid. If the lids get warped, I can always composite the original back over the top later. Now, the problem with only adding these two shapes is that they'll actually warp all the other pixels in the image. So we need to add what's called a boundary shape to tell the spline warp node where to stop its warping. Here, I'll create something kind of like a superhero eye mask shape. This tells the warper that it's allowed to warp pixels inside this area, but nothing outside. I need to enable it as a boundary shape by clicking this Enable icon. Okay, so the way spline warpers do their thing is by shifting pixels from one shape to another. Right now, we've created what are called the source shapes. Now I right-click on each in turn and choose Duplicate and Join. This creates a target shape for both of the screen left eye shapes. Right now you won't see any warping because both the source and target shapes are identical. At the top left of the viewer controls for the spline warp, you'll see 5 buttons with letters. The ones we care about right now are the 2 A buttons. When the regular A to the left is selected, we're looking at the unwarped version of the shot. When the italicized A is selected, we're looking at the warped version. What we want to do is adjust the target to form a different shape, and that will create the warp. To protect yourself from accidentally moving the wrong shape, it's a good idea to set the viewer up so that you only see the target shape in the warped view and the original source shape in the unwarped view. Now, when I'm in the unwarped view, I can only adjust the source shape, and in the warped view, I can only adjust the target shape. You'll see if I now expand the target pupil shape, the pupil gets warped outward to keep up with the change in the shape. Now you can temporarily hand animate the warp off and on by dragging the root warp slider. Notice how the warp affects the pixels right up to the edge of our border shape, but stops there. Now, it looks extremely unnatural for a number of reasons. Firstly, the specular highlights on the eyes are getting warped as well. If the pupil was really expanding, the highlight reflections would remain consistent. Secondly, the eyelid gets distorted. As I said before, we can fix that later. But finally, pushed to the extreme, the iris distorts and looks unnaturally compressed. The good news with this problem is that we can choose how far we can push the root warp slider before the illusion breaks. Okay, so things work for frame 70, but the illusion falls apart at other frames because the warp doesn't move with the eye. Obviously, that's what our trackers were for. Let's add them. I'll select the first shape, switch to the Transform tab, click the Animation menu button, and choose Link to Tracker 1 SL or Screen Left Pupil. Now, this will cause the shape to disappear because it's being moved entirely by that tracker. We need to zero out its position at the current frame, frame 70. To do this, I'll click the Animation menu button again and choose Edit Expression. This is the expression that was pasted in when we chose to link the tracker. I'll copy the X expression, add a minus sign, and then paste the expression right back in to subtract it away from itself, zeroing things out. You'll see that the result value now shows as 0. Now, obviously, this isn't much good since we'll just be subtracting the track away from itself at every frame. What we really want to do is subtract the position at the current frame so that the position of the tracking data at every other frame will align relative to this frame, frame 70. To do that, just add the current frame number, in this case 70, in parentheses after the subtracted expression value. I'll repeat the process for the Y expression, and you'll find the shape now snaps back into place. Now we need to do the same thing for the rest of the shapes. Stepping through the timeline, your shapes should now keep up with the changes in the eye position. You may need to set a minor keyframe adjustment at the beginning of the sequence, especially for the boundary shape. But for the most part, the shape should track nicely. Rinse and repeat for the other eye, and we have our warp effect. Okay, time to fix the lids. Back in my reference frame, frame 70, I'll create a simple shape for the lid that comes in just over the iris. Then I'll add a blur node to soften up the border. I could expression link the tracking data again, but in this case it's easier just to copy and paste the tracker node. I need to make sure for this left eyelid that I deactivate the screen right eye tracking data. Then in the Transform tab, I'll set the transform type to Match Move and set the reference frame to the current frame, frame 70. And I'll repeat the process for the right eyelid. When I copy and paste the tracker from the left eyelid, this time I'll deselect the screen left tracker and enable the screen right tracker. Since I copied from the other eyelid's tracker, the transform tab settings will already be correct. I'll combine the two eyebrow mats using a merge node set to the maximum blend mode. And now I'll add a copy node to an instance of the source footage and copy in the eyelid mats as an alpha channel. Adding a pre-molt node, I now have the unwarped upper eyelids to merge over the top of the warped shot, removing any artifacting that the warp might have caused on the lids. Just be careful with this. Remember that the warp will continue to pull pixels right up to the edge of the border shape, or actually even a little bit beyond. So to avoid any discontinuity in your patch, you may need to expand the length of your eyelid shapes or soften the edge further to help with the transition. Let's tackle highlights. Unfortunately, unlike our previous video on color correcting eyes, we can't simply recomposite the original specular highlights over the top of the warped eyes. We need to completely paint out the highlights first. Fortunately, the highlights typically won't change position much during a shot like this. I need to start by stabilizing the footage using the existing trackers set to stabilize instead of a match move. Our full painting lesson in Nuke is beyond the scope of this video, but I will point out that we need to make the paint strokes persist on all frames. Starting at our frame 70 reference, I'll use the clone tool to clone out the highlights. I'll then step through and check how these strokes hold up over the frame range. Now, things get a little messy toward the start, so I'll add some additional strokes to patch that. And then make sure they don't mess up anything back at frame 70. Finally, I'll copy and paste the tracker node after the paint node and set it to match move to add back the original movement into the shot. Now, whenever you do this whole stabilize, destabilize workflow, you significantly soften the image. To avoid this, I'll make sure I'm only compositing my paint work back over the source footage, not the whole softened image. In the rotor paint node, I can enable the output mask. Because of brush softness, this ends up being a little too faint, so I'll add a grade node, set it to alpha, and then crank up the intensity of the alpha to make sure that our mat of the paint work contains everything we need it to. I then add a pre-molt node to cut away everything except my paint work. I'll stop and tidy things up a little. Once I've repeated the paint work for the other eye, I'll merge the two paint patches together and then merge the result over the source footage. And the result is a kind of creepy, lifeless look, but one that serves our purpose. This feeds into our warp node, and then we merge our eyelid fix over that. Now that we don't have to worry about distorted specular highlights, it's time to add the original highlights back over the top of our warp. I'll add a luma keyer in the form of Nuke's keyer node. And pre-multiply it to get just the highlights. Right now, we're getting the rest of the face as well in the luma key. One of the nice things about Nuke's spline-warper is that you can copy and paste the shapes to use as regular matte shapes as well as warp shapes. I'll do that for the iris shapes I created earlier, the source shapes, obviously. You'll see that Nuke was extra nice to me and copied the tracking expressions as well, so that my iris shapes are moving along with the shot for free. I'll use an in merge node to put the highlights inside the iris shapes. And I'll tidy up again. And now I'll simply merge the highlights back over the top of the final composite. That's it. The last thing to do is animate the effect. Let's set a 0 keyframe at around frame 45. And then by, let's say, frame 60, I'll push the expansion of the pupils up to a level where the effect still looks believable. And we're done. The lids and specular highlights are composited back over the warped image to create a nice, convincing effect. Now, to push this into the otherworldly realm, just change the target shape of the pupil from something round to something more like, say, a cat slit eye, and alter the color over time. I can use the same iris matte for my color correction. And that's a wrap. Between this and the last episode, you should now have a tool set for creating just about any eye effect you need. Just remember to keep it subtle. Audiences are very sensitive to changes in eyes, so things can start to look very fake very quickly if you push things too hard. Good luck and catch you next time.